Progress often feels slow in a way that is difficult to describe. It isn't dramatic or chaotic. It doesn't look like failure. Instead, it feels quiet, flat, and underwhelming. You're doing what you said you would do. You're showing up. You're not avoiding completely. And yet, nothing seems to be changing in a way you can clearly see or feel. There's no sense of momentum, no clear signal that things are moving forward. This creates a specific kind of discomfort. Not panic, not despair, just a low-level frustration that sits in the background, because from the outside, it looks like progress should be happening. There are no obvious mistakes, no major breakdowns, just an absence of visible movement. This is often the moment where people start quietly questioning themselves. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just internally. They begin to wonder whether they misunderstood how progress works, or whether they are missing something fundamental. When progress feels slow, it rarely stays neutral. It starts to feel personal. Effort creates expectation, even when we don't consciously acknowledge it. The mind assumes that effort should produce visible results within a reasonable time frame. When that doesn't happen, the brain looks for explanations. And the most accessible explanation is internal. Something must be wrong. Something must be lacking. But this interpretation assumes that progress is linear and directly proportional to effort. In reality, many forms of progress don't work that way at all, especially when progress involves internal change, emotional regulation, behavioral patterns, or long-term adaptation. In those cases, the work is happening below the surface first. The system is reorganizing before it produces outward results. Because that internal work isn't visible, it's easy to assume it isn't happening. That's why slow progress so often turns into self-doubt. Not because the person is failing, but because the process itself hides its early stages. Most people expect progress to feel like momentum, a sense of movement, a feeling of acceleration, clear feedback that confirms something is working. That expectation comes from environments where feedback is immediate, physical tasks, short-term goals, mechanical systems. But internal progress doesn't behave like that. It develops quietly and unevenly. There are long periods where nothing seems to change, followed by moments where change suddenly becomes visible. This creates the illusion that progress arrives all at once, when in reality it has been accumulating gradually. The problem isn't that progress is slow. The problem is that the early stages don't produce signals that the mind recognizes as success. Without feedback, the brain fills the gap with interpretation. It assumes stagnation. It assumes inefficiency. But in many cases, what's happening is preparation rather than movement. The system is adjusting, stabilizing, and learning how to hold change before it allows momentum to appear. One of the most confusing parts of slow progress is that understanding doesn't seem to help. You know what you're doing. You know why you're doing it. You understand the logic behind the process. And yet, progress still feels slow. This creates a contradiction. If understanding is present, why isn't movement faster? The reason is that understanding reduces confusion, not time. It clarifies direction, but it doesn't override adaptation. Change still has to be integrated at the level of behavior, emotion, and nervous system response. That integration requires repetition. Repetition requires tolerance for uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't feel productive. This is why people often feel impatient with themselves at this stage. They assume that once something makes sense, it should move quickly. When it doesn't, they interpret the delay as failure rather than integration. But slow progress at this stage is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that change is still being absorbed. One reason progress feels slow is that the nervous system moves at a different pace than conscious intention. Conscious thought can decide quickly. The nervous system cannot. Its primary role is stability, not speed. Any meaningful change, new habits, new responses, new ways of acting, is evaluated first for safety. If change happens too quickly, the system interprets it as instability that triggers resistance, hesitation, or fatigue. Slow adaptation, on the other hand, allows recalibration without threat. This means that progress often unfolds at a pace that feels unsatisfying to the thinking mind but acceptable to the system regulating behavior. From the inside, this feels like delay. From the system's perspective, it's regulation. This mismatch is why people often feel impatient even when they're doing everything right. They're judging progress by conscious urgency while the nervous system is prioritizing survival and predictability. The slowness isn't a malfunction. It's a built-in feature designed to prevent disruption. Effort is often mistaken for acceleration. When progress feels slow, the instinctive response is to apply more effort, more focus, more pressure, more intensity. But effort increases energy expenditure, not necessarily speed. In some situations, increased effort creates friction instead of momentum, especially when the system is already adapting. Pushing harder can lead to tension, fatigue, or withdrawal rather than progress. This is why people sometimes feel worse after increasing effort. Not because effort is harmful, but because it's being applied to a system that hasn't finished adjusting. Progress isn't delayed by a lack of effort in these cases. It's delayed by the time required for integration. Effort without integration doesn't move things forward faster. It often makes the process feel heavier. This creates the illusion that nothing is working, when in reality the system is simply overloaded and slowing itself down. Progress feels slow most intensely when it's compared. Comparison compresses time. You see outcomes without seeing the process that led to them. You see visible results without seeing delays, false starts, or internal resistance. This creates unrealistic expectations about how long progress should take. When your own experience doesn't match those expectations, it feels insufficient, even when it's entirely normal. Comparison doesn't just distort perception, it rewrites timelines. It makes gradual change feel like failure because it isn't dramatic. But progress that lasts is rarely dramatic. It's repetitive, uneven, and often invisible while it's happening. When comparison is removed, progress often feels less discouraging, not because it speeds up, but because it's no longer being measured against imagined standards that ignore process. Failure produces information. It tells you something didn't work. Stagnation produces ambiguity. It's unclear whether to continue, adjust, or stop. That ambiguity is difficult to tolerate. When progress feels slow, it often feels like stagnation rather than movement. And stagnation creates more discomfort than failure because it leaves the situation unresolved. There's no clear signal to respond to. This is why people often abandon progress during slow phases. Not because they've failed, but because they don't know how to interpret what's happening. The absence of clear feedback creates doubt. But slow progress isn't the absence of change, it's the absence of visible confirmation. That distinction matters because mistaking ambiguity for failure leads people to quit processes that are still unfolding. There is a phase of progress that doesn't feel like progress at all. It feels like effort without return, repetition without reward. This is the hidden work phase. During this phase, internal patterns are weakening while new ones are being rehearsed. Old responses are losing strength, but new responses haven't stabilized yet. From the outside, nothing appears to change. From the inside, the system is working continuously. This phase is mentally exhausting because it doesn't offer reassurance. There's no feedback to confirm that the work is effective. This is why people often describe feeling tired without feeling accomplished. The work is real, but the evidence isn't visible yet. Many people abandon progress during this phase because it feels inefficient. But this phase is often the most important one. It's where durability is built. The system is learning how to hold change without collapsing back into old patterns. When progress feels slow, stopping often feels reasonable rather than emotional. It doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like making a rational decision. The cost appears high. The return appears low. From that perspective, disengaging seems sensible. This is why slow progress is so dangerous. It doesn't trigger alarm, it triggers logic. But that logic is based on incomplete information. It evaluates the present moment without accounting for delayed payoff, and delayed payoff is a defining feature of meaningful change. Quitting at this stage doesn't mean the process failed. It means the evaluation happened before the results were visible, and fortunately most people never realize how close they were to movement when they stopped, because slow progress doesn't announce itself before it shifts. Evaluating progress too early creates false conclusions. Systems that haven't stabilized can't be accurately judged. Early evaluation mistakes incompleteness for ineffectiveness. When something hasn't finished forming, it often looks broken. This is especially true for internal change. Habits, emotional responses, and identity shifts don't follow clean timelines. They fluctuate before they settle. When people evaluate progress during fluctuation, they often assume regression. But fluctuation is part of adaptation. Stability comes later. Early evaluation doesn't just misread progress, it disrupts it. Constantly reassessing whether something is working can pull attention away from the repetition required to let it work in the first place. Pressure changes how progress is perceived. Under pressure, slow progress feels unacceptable. The same pace that felt tolerable before now feels urgent, inadequate, or wrong. Pressure narrows attention. It reduces patience. It creates a sense that something must change immediately. But pressure doesn't speed adaptation, it distorts interpretation. When people feel pressured, they often conclude that progress is failing when it's simply slow. This leads to impulsive changes, abandoned processes, and unnecessary resets. Pressure doesn't make progress faster. It makes people less tolerant of the pace progress actually requires, and that intolerance is often what disrupts momentum. Consistency is often described as a solution, but it rarely feels rewarding while it's happening. Before results appear, consistency feels repetitive, quiet, and dull. There's no sense of progress attached to it, just the requirement to continue. This is why consistency is difficult to maintain. Not because it's hard, but because it doesn't offer reinforcement early on. The brain expects feedback. When it doesn't arrive, motivation weakens. This leads people to assume consistency isn't working, when in reality it hasn't been visible long enough to register. The reward for consistency is delayed by design. It arrives after accumulation, not during repetition. That delay creates discomfort, especially for people who are paying attention to effort. When effort doesn't feel acknowledged, even internally, it starts to feel pointless. But consistency isn't meant to feel effective early. It's meant to be tolerated, until it becomes effective later. Continuing without proof is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of slow progress. It requires acting without reassurance. Not blind faith, but tolerance for uncertainty. The mind wants confirmation that effort is justified. When that confirmation doesn't arrive, doubt fills the gap. This doubt isn't dramatic, it's subtle. It shows up as hesitation, second-guessing, or quiet disengagement. Many people interpret this doubt as intuition. They assume it's telling them to stop. But in many cases, it's simply the discomfort of acting without feedback. Progress often requires continuing through this phase, not because the process is perfect, but because the system hasn't finished responding yet. The discomfort doesn't signal failure. It signals transition. When progress slows, it often looks like regression. There's less visible movement, less emotional reward, less excitement. This creates the impression that something has gone wrong. But slowing down often means the system is integrating change. Speed decreases when stability is being built. This happens in learning, habit formation, and emotional regulation. The system pauses expansion to reinforce structure. From the outside, this looks like stagnation. From the inside, it's consolidation. Mistaking consolidation for regression leads people to abandon processes at the moment they're becoming sustainable. Progress doesn't always feel forward-moving. Sometimes it feels heavier before it feels lighter. Slow progress triggers a powerful impulse to change methods, new strategies, new systems, new approaches. The assumption is that something else must work better. Sometimes change is necessary. But often, changing methods during slow progress resets adaptation rather than improving it. The system has to start integrating from the beginning again. This creates the illusion of productivity, something is happening, while actually delaying results. Method changes feel active, staying consistent feels passive, but consistency allows accumulation. Constant change prevents it. This is why people who frequently switch approaches often feel busy without feeling effective. They're always restarting adaptation, rather than allowing it to complete. Slow progress is often interpreted as inefficiency, but it's usually signaling something else. It often means that change is happening at a depth that can't be rushed. Surface-level changes move quickly and disappear just as fast. Deeper changes move slowly because they alter how decisions, reactions, and behaviors are generated. When progress feels slow, it's often because the system is rebuilding foundations rather than adding outcomes. This kind of work doesn't feel productive in the short term. There are no visible markers to point to, but it creates stability that fast progress cannot. Many people confuse speed with effectiveness because speed feels reassuring. But reassurance isn't the same as durability. Slow progress often indicates that the system is prioritizing permanence over performance. Speed measures how quickly something changes on the surface. It does not measure whether that change will last. Lasting change requires integration, and integration takes time. This is why fast progress often collapses under pressure, while slow progress tends to hold. When progress is measured only by speed, anything that doesn't move quickly feels wrong. But when progress is measured by stability, slow movement makes sense. Stability can't be rushed. It has to be tested internally. The system needs repeated exposure to new patterns before it trusts them. That trust doesn't announce itself. It develops quietly. Speed creates motion. Stability creates retention. Confusing the two leads people to abandon progress that is actually working. Progress is often imagined as momentum, a force that builds once movement starts. But in many cases, progress works more like accumulation. Small changes stack quietly over time until they reach a threshold where results suddenly become visible. This creates the illusion that nothing was happening before the breakthrough. In reality, the breakthrough was the result of accumulated change finally crossing a visible boundary. This is why people often describe progress as sudden, even though it wasn't. The slow phase wasn't empty. It was preparatory. Accumulation feels unsatisfying because it doesn't feel dynamic, but it's how most durable change is built. Patience is often misunderstood as waiting, but patience in the context of progress is active tolerance. It's the decision to continue without reinforcement. That requires effort. It requires regulation. It requires resisting the impulse to intervene prematurely. Patience doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing the same thing long enough for it to work. That's not passive. It's disciplined. The difficulty of patience is why slow progress feels harder than fast failure. Fast failure resolves uncertainty. Slow progress requires living inside it. But it's often that willingness to tolerate uncertainty that allows change to complete. Much of the discomfort around slow progress comes from expectation rather than reality. Expectations are often shaped by visible outcomes, stories of rapid success, or past experiences where feedback was immediate. When current progress doesn't match those expectations, it feels wrong, even when it isn't. The experience of slowness is amplified by the belief that things should be moving faster. This belief isn't always conscious. It sits in the background, influencing how effort is interpreted. When expectations are misaligned with how change actually unfolds, Frustration increases. Progress itself hasn't changed, interpretation has. Understanding this doesn't speed progress up, but it reduces unnecessary tension around it. The work feels lighter when it's no longer measured against an unrealistic timeline. Most people expect the beginning to be the hardest part, but often the middle is more difficult. Early effort is energized by novelty and hope. Later effort is supported by results. The middle has neither. It's repetitive, uncertain, and quiet. This is where progress feels slowest. Not because nothing is happening, but because motivation is no longer fueled by excitement or reward. This phase requires endurance rather than intensity. And endurance doesn't feel impressive, it feels ordinary. That ordinariness is often mistaken for failure, but it's actually the point where change becomes real rather than performative. When progress feels slow, it's tempting to assume something is wrong with the method, the effort, or the person. But in most cases, nothing is malfunctioning. The system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's integrating change at a pace that preserves stability. Slow progress doesn't indicate weakness, lack of discipline, or poor strategy. It indicates adaptation. The problem isn't the pace. It's the expectation that progress should always feel rewarding. Once that expectation loosens, slow progress becomes easier to tolerate, even if it doesn't become more exciting. Progress feels slow because meaningful change doesn't announce itself while it's happening. It works quietly beneath awareness until it becomes stable enough to surface. When that happens, the change often feels sudden, as if it appeared out of nowhere. But it didn't. It was built gradually during periods that felt unproductive and unrewarding. Understanding this doesn't make progress faster, but it prevents unnecessary abandonment. Slow progress isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's often a sign that something real is forming, even if you can't see it yet.